Standing on the porch of the house that had slowly bled my bank account dry for 7 years, I realized that the only thing more expensive than my family's love was the price I paid to finally walk away from it. The air in Oak Creek was biting a damp Pacific Northwest cold that seemed to seep through my wool coat and settle deep within my bones, matching the chill that had been growing in my heart since I boarded the flight from JFK. I was Evelyn Thorne, a 32-year-old woman who had spent a decade building a life in the jagged skyline of New York City, designing buildings that were meant to stand the test of time, while my own foundations were being systematically dismantled by the people who shared my DNA. My mother had called me 3 weeks ago, her voice a fragile reed trembling in the wind, sobbing about how the house felt empty, how my father's health was a flickering candle, and how the entire family needed me home for their 40th anniversary. She played the chords of my guilt like a master musician, knowing exactly which notes would make me fold. I had spent a small fortune on a last-minute flight, endured 12 hours of travel through delays and crowded terminals, and arrived at their doorstep looking like a ghost of the woman I worked so hard to become. I clutched the handles of my suitcase, which was packed not with my own finery, but with expensive gifts for Marcus's children tablets and designer clothes I couldn't really afford if I wanted to keep my own savings account healthy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic thud that whispered of a hope I knew was dangerous, the hope that this time, just this once, I would be greeted as a daughter and not as a solution. When the door finally creaked open, the warmth from the hallway spilled out, but it didn't reach me. My mother stood there, her eyes immediately bypassing my tired face to land on the heavy luggage at my feet. There was no embrace, no soft exclamation of how much I'd been missed, only a sharp, practical assessment of my utility. She told me with a casualness that felt like a slap that I would be staying behind to watch Marcus's kids while the rest of them went on a private retreat to a mountain lodge. My brother Marcus appeared behind her, his expensive sunglasses perched atop his head, a smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted the strap of a leather duffel bag that I recognized as a gift I'd bought him 3 birthdays ago. He told the children not to get their sticky hands on my expensive city clothes because I was exhausted, his voice dripping with a sarcasm that invited the whole room to laugh at my expense. As their laughter echoed through the foyer, a sound that should have been joyful but felt like jagged glass, something inside me simply ceased to function. The switch that had kept me tethered to my role as the family's silent provider and perennial safety net flicked to the off position. I didn't scream. I didn't let the hot sting of tears blur my vision. Instead, I felt a strange, crystalline clarity wash over me. I set my suitcase down with a heavy thud, looked my mother directly in her watering, manipulative eyes, and spoke the words that would bring their carefully constructed house of cards crashing down. I told them that the vacation was over, and as the color drained from their faces, and my mother began to stammer in disbelief, I knew that the era of Evelyn the nanny and Evelyn, the ATM, had officially come to a close. To truly understand the weight of that moment, one would have to look back at the years of quiet erosion that led to it. My mother's desperate FaceTime calls were never about missing my company. They were tactical maneuvers designed to scout my financial perimeter. 2 weeks before she lured me back to Washington, she had sent a barrage of messages featuring brochures for the High Alpine Sanctuary, a resort that cost more per night than my monthly rent in Brooklyn. She had sighed through the text bubbles, lamenting how a couple on a fixed income could never dream of such luxury unless a miracle occurred. I was that miracle, or at least I had been trained to believe I had to be. Every request for help began with the phrase, "just this once a lie," that had become the soundtrack of my adult life. When my father claimed he needed a specialized physical therapist, I wired the funds without question, only to see my mother posting photos of a vintage mahogany vanity she'd found at an estate sale days later. When Marcus's third attempt at a tech startup failed because he spent the capital on a leased sports car to look the part, I was the one who consolidated his debt to keep him from bankruptcy. I lived in a walk-up apartment where the radiator hissed, and the space was so cramped I had to store my shoes in the oven, yet I was unknowingly subsidizing a lifestyle of leisure for people who viewed my hard work as a communal resource. I walked to the subway in the rain while paying for the premium gas in my father's truck and the high-speed internet that allowed Marcus to spend his days playing video games instead of looking for a job. This time, however, I had come prepared with more than just gifts for ungrateful children. Before I had even requested the time off from my firm, I had spent nights hunched over my laptop, the blue light reflecting off my glasses, as I performed a forensic audit of my own life. I gathered every digital receipt, every wire transfer confirmation, and every manipulative text message that preceded a request for money. I discovered things that made my blood run cold, including a mortgage document for the very house I was standing in, which bore my signature from a time I had been told I was merely helping them qualify for a lower interest rate as a formality. In reality, I was a co-borrower, and I had been quietly covering the shortfalls for years, my credit score a silent hostage to their fiscal irresponsibility. I realized that my family only saw me as a person when there was a line item that needed covering. I had considered staying in New York and cutting them off from a distance, but the anger burned too brightly for that. I wanted to see the moment the realization hit them. I wanted to be in the room when the fountain of free money finally ran dry. I had booked a consultation with a high-end financial advisor, a woman with a voice like velvet and a mind like a razor, who helped me draft a series of documents that would serve as my declaration of independence. So as I stood in the kitchen and watched my mother tap the glossy itinerary on the counter, acting as if my presence as a servant was a settled matter of law, I felt a grim sort of satisfaction. She talked about how they needed this break, how they had worked so hard, and how lucky they were to have a daughter who understood the value of family. I looked at the resort confirmation on her phone, saw the last 4 digits of my own credit card, and smiled a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I asked everyone to gather in the dining room, my voice calm and devoid of the usual tremor of seeking approval. My father took his place at the head of the long oak table, a position he occupied with a misplaced sense of authority, while Marcus lounged in his chair, still checking his phone for notifications from his latest failed venture. My mother hovered near the sideboard, clutching the resort papers like a holy relic. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward them, revealing a spreadsheet that was a masterpiece of cold, hard fact. I told them that before anyone went to the mountains, we needed to have an honest conversation about the cost of being a thorn. Marcus groaned, accusing me of ruining the mood with my typical corporate rigidity, and my father muttered about how I'd become too cold in the city. My mother tried the wounded bird act, whispering about how much stress they had been under and pleading with me not to start a fight. I didn't take the bait. I simply began to read the numbers, my voice steady, as I navigated through 3 years of their financial parasitism. I pointed out the $1,200 for a mortgage. They said they'd handled the $2,500 for Marcus's business expenses that turned out to be a weekend in Las Vegas, and the endless stream of smaller amounts that added up to a staggering $60,000. I showed them the screenshots of their pleas for help, followed by photos of their lavish spending. The room grew so quiet that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that marked the seconds of their dying privilege. The total at the bottom of the screen was highlighted in a brutal, uncompromising red. When I told them I had sent over $60,000 to this house in 3 years, Marcus's face went from smug to ghostly. My mother kept shaking her head, her lips moving in a silent prayer that the math would somehow change if she denied it enough. I reached into my bag and pulled out the legal acknowledgement. I'd had drafted a document stating that the money provided was a loan, not a gift, and that a repayment schedule would begin immediately. My father finally found his voice barking about how family doesn't put family in debt and accusing me of being a heartless bookkeeper. I met his gaze with a level of steel I didn't know I possessed, reminding him that family also doesn't commit identity theft by hiding a mortgage in their daughter's name. I told them I wasn't expecting the money back all at once, but I was done living in a world where I was the villain for being successful while they were the victims for being lazy. I told my mother that if she ever tried to paint me as the ungrateful child to the neighbors again, I would print these spreadsheets and hand-deliver them to every house on the block. The humiliation she had used as a weapon against me for years was now a blade I held to her own reputation. Then came the final blow, the one that turned their dream vacation into a memory before it even began. I clicked over to the tab showing the resort reservation and pointed to the word that made my father lurch out of his chair in a blind panic: cancelled. I informed them that since the trip had been booked with my card, my account and my stolen labor, I had taken the liberty of reclaiming my funds. The package was refunded, the flight credits were moved to my personal account, and the mountain lodge was no longer an option. My father shouted that I had no right to take their tickets, but I reminded him that they were never theirs to begin with. They were a fantasy built on the back of my exhaustion. I didn't flinch when he tried to use his height to intimidate me. I simply moved to the next window on my screen, which showed the bank correspondence regarding the house. I had my financial advisor on a video call, her face appearing in the corner of the screen like a digital herald of doom. She explained in a measured professional tone that as a co-borrower I was exercising my right to be removed from the loan, an action that would force a total re-evaluation of their ability to pay. If they couldn't qualify on their own, which we all knew they couldn't, the house would have to be sold to satisfy the debt. My mother's voice broke as she realized the walls of her comfortable subsidized world were literally closing in. She cried about how they couldn't afford to move, how they had no savings, and how I was making them homeless. I told her that I wasn't making them anything. I was simply stopping the life support that had kept their delusions alive. I handed my father the formal notice that all automatic payments for the mortgage, the utilities, the internet, and even their streaming services were being terminated as of that moment. I watched Marcus realize that his safety net had been shredded, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way to escape the responsibility that was finally landing on his shoulders. I told him he was 34 years old, and it was time he stopped using his children as a shield for his own inadequacy. The softer part of me, the little girl who used to crave her father's praise and her mother's touch, tried to speak up, tried to tell me to stop, but I silenced her. I remembered the laughter at the door. I remembered the years of working 3 jobs in New York while they went to brunch on my dime. I hit the final cancel button on the last autopay, and the pings of confirmation on my phone felt like a victory mark. I closed my laptop and stood up my legs, feeling like they were made of lead, yet I had never felt lighter. I told them that if they wanted to call me a villain, they were free to do so, but they would be doing it from a house they had to pay for themselves. I picked up my suitcase and began to walk toward the door, my father's voice following me, telling me never to come back if I was going to hold money over their heads. I paused in the doorway and told him that if I wasn't welcome without my credit card, then I was never truly welcome at all. I stepped out into the Washington rain, the cold air hitting my face like a benediction. I didn't look back as I ordered an Uber, and I didn't cry when the door slammed behind me. I gave the driver an address that was only 15 minutes away, but felt like it was on another planet. It was a modest 1-bedroom condo in a new development downtown, a place I had purchased in secret months ago with the savings I had managed to hide from their prying eyes. I had planned to tell them eventually, to bridge the gap slowly, but they had forced my hand. When I entered my own space, the air didn't smell like my mother's floral perfume or the stale tension of my childhood home. It smelled like nothing, a beautiful, empty canvas of a life that belonged solely to me. I dropped my suitcase and stood by the window watching the city lights of the harbor. For the first time in my adult life, my phone was silent. There were no frantic texts, no guilt trips disguised as check-ins. I opened my banking app one last time and meticulously went through the list of shared accounts, clicking the delete button on every single one. The Disney Plus account that Marcus's kids used, the grocery delivery service my mother used to order organic produce. She didn't pay for the cloud storage that held photos of a family I no longer recognized. Cancel. Each one was a tether cut, a weight lifted. I sat on the floor of my empty living room, brewing a cup of tea in a kitchen that was entirely mine, and felt a profound sense of peace. I knew the fallout would be immense. I knew the Facebook posts would start, the ones where my father would play the martyr, and the community would rally around the poor, abandoned parents. I knew I would be the topic of hushed conversations at the local diner. But as I sat there in the quiet, I realized that their opinion of me was a currency that no longer held any value in my world. The first wave of social media backlash arrived exactly as predicted. A friend from high school sent me a screenshot of my father's post, a long, rambling diatribe about how some children lose their souls when they move to the big city and how he was praying for the strength to survive the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. The comments were a testament to how well my parents had curated their image as the perfect, hard-working couple. People called me a disgrace. They offered to start a fundraiser for my parents' bills. They spoke of the sanctity of the Fifth Commandment. For a moment, the old Evelyn wanted to log in and fight to post the spreadsheets and the recordings of my mother's manipulation to scream the truth until the whole town heard it. But then I realized that the truth didn't need a megaphone to be real. My parents knew what they had done, and more importantly, the bank knew what they owed. I didn't need the validation of people who only knew the version of me that paid for the appetizers at the town festival. I muted the notifications and went back to work, focusing on a project for a community center in the Bronx that actually stood for something meaningful. A few weeks into my new life in Washington, the reality of their situation began to manifest in less digital ways. My mother started sending messages that weren't angry but terrified. She spoke of letters from the IRS of the bank's refusal to accept partial payments of Marcus having to sell his car just to keep the lights on. She was finally seeing the skeletal frame of the life she had built, and without my constant padding, if sharp and uncomfortable. I didn't ignore her, but I didn't offer a penny. I told her that she needed to speak to a credit counselor and that Marcus needed to find a second job. I was no longer the architect of their comfort. I was a distant observer of their consequences. Marcus eventually asked to meet me at a park away from the prying eyes of our parents. He looked different, the arrogance replaced by a harried, desperate energy. He told me that Dad was losing his mind, that the house was likely going on the market, and that he was working 12-hour shifts at a warehouse. He admitted for the first time in his life that he had been a coward for letting me carry the load for so long. He didn't ask for money, which was the only reason I didn't walk away. He asked me how I did it, how I managed to keep my head above water when everything felt like it was drowning. I told him that I stopped waiting for someone to save me and started saving myself. It was a hard lesson, one that I had learned in the trenches of New York, and one he was finally learning in the ruins of his own making. By the time the actual anniversary of my parents' marriage arrived, the grand celebration they had envisioned had been replaced by a quiet, somber dinner at a local chain restaurant. There were no mountain lodges, no expensive gifts, no speeches about the legacy of the Thorne family. I didn't attend, but I sent a card with a short, polite message. My mother came to visit my condo a few days later, her eyes wide as she took in the simplicity of my life. She saw that I wasn't living in a palace of greed, as my father had told her, but in a small, efficient space that reflected the reality of my salary. She sat on my second-hand sofa and cried not the loud, performative tears of the past, but the quiet tears of a woman who realized she had traded her daughter's heart for a vanity table and a few years of luxury she didn't earn. She handed me a small check, $100, and told me it was the first installment of what she owed me. She said she had taken a job as a receptionist at a dental office. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant against the backdrop of $60,000, but it was the first time in 32 years that my mother had given me something that didn't have a hidden cost. I didn't cash the check right away. I kept it on my mantle as a reminder of the day the power dynamic finally shifted. My father still hasn't spoken to me, and he likely never will. His pride is a fortress that won't allow him to admit he was a parasite, and I've made my peace with that. I've realized that being a daughter doesn't mean being a martyr. Love isn't a debt that is paid in installments of your own sanity and future. The people who truly love you don't ask you to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. They don't look at your success as a communal bank account. It took me 30 years to learn that my value wasn't tied to how much I could provide, but to who I was when I had nothing left to give. As the holidays approached, I didn't feel the usual knot of dread in my stomach. I wasn't checking my bank balance to see if I could afford their expectations. I was planning a small dinner for myself and a few friends I had made in the local architecture community. I bought a small tree, decorated it with things that made me happy, and sat in the quiet of my own home listening to the rain on the roof. The lesson I learned in that cold kitchen in Oak Creek is one that I carry with me into every building I design. A structure is only as strong as its foundation, and if that foundation is built on lies and exploitation, it will eventually crumble, no matter how beautiful the facade. My family's facade had been stunning, a picture-perfect image of suburban success, but it was hollow. By walking away, I didn't destroy my family. I simply stopped holding up the ruins. I gave them the chance to build something real, something they actually owned, even if it was smaller and less impressive than what they had before. And in the process, I built myself a life that was solid, honest, and entirely my own. The silence of my condo wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of freedom. I had finally stopped paying the price for a love that was never free, and in doing so, I had finally become my own person, the first thorn in generations to stand on her own 2 feet without stepping on someone else's.